Well, hello everyone. Happy Tuesday. Happy tornado warning day. For those of you who are here in Chicago with us, my name is Juan Espinoza. I'm the Chief Research Informatics Officer here at Lurie Children's, as well as the PI and Executive Director of CTIP. And this is day two of Lurie MedTech Week. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Today, our session today is called Inside Pediatric Innovation, and it's a fireside chat with two of our fantastic investigators, clinician investigators here at the Lurie Northwestern community.
No,
We wanted to do
camera
this session.
is on.
Oh, I think someone needs muting online. As we think about Lurie MedTech Week and think about the different aspects of how pediatric device innovation happens from concept to commercialization. A lot of this work happens with industry or with the FDA, with engineers, but there's a critical role that happens with clinician innovators, for whom this is often a very nonlinear path. The when we this kind of research occupies an interesting niche. When you think about a broader academic career, it's a little bit of research, it's a little bit of innovation, it's a little bit of operations, it's a lot of networking. It's not the traditional RO1 independent physician scientist career, but it's also not the traditional clinician educator. So it occupies kind of a different space. And so we wanted to use this time to talk with two such folks from our community to share a little bit about their careers, how they got there, what they're working on, to the extent that that might be useful as an opportunity for others who are interested, whether you're in training or early career or mid career, if this is something that you've always wanted to do. We thought this would be a really wonderful opportunity to learn from two people who I'll say so have been reasonably successful. That's all right, false modesty. Uh, in really finding that niche for themselves. Today, I'm going to be asking our guests a little bit about their journey, how they got to where they are, what they're currently working on, what challenges they face, but what have been some of the really nice opportunities that they've seen, and any advice they have for others who are interested in this work. So without further ado, I'm actually going to ask each of our guests to introduce themselves, but we'll start with Dr. Jessica Walters. Jesse, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a huge honor to be here. So, my name is Jessie Walter. I feel a little bit out of place here because I am actually on Northwestern faculty. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist by training with specialty in infertility care. But
You make peds possible, so it's perfect.
there you go. There you go. We are a small part of the children journey. So I'm on faculty over at Northwestern, and my one of my current roles is new as of this year. I am the research clinical director of clinical research at QSI Teams, which lives here in this building. And it's a new institute really focused on translational engineering for advanced medical systems, trying to help devices that start out in the prototype phase, but get them into actual clinical testing and larger scale programs. So it's a really rich environment where I collaborate with a lot of different people, pediatricians included, device and disease agnostic, trying to help translate technologies to actually get them to the bedside.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jesse. And then, Seth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, also delighted to be here. Seth Goldstein, one of the general and thoracic surgeons at Lurie. I'll tell a little bit of my journey. I started in university studying biomedical engineering and then had a short stint in industry. And then that was for a Johnson and Johnson subsidiary. And I ended up learning a lot about that aspect of commercialization that I've realized 10, 15 years later I had completely forgotten and had to relearn more on that later. But after a stop at some graduate school, I decided, as I saw the continuum of conception to commercialization, I saw it as a push-pull between the engineering and the clinician. I think there are many more dimensions to that, maybe again, more on that later. But I'd been bitten with the clinical bug, and I say that because when I tell the narrative, it sounds like it was on a whim, but you got to be willing to sacrifice a decade of your life to then do all the clinical training. I don't mean to phrase it like that exactly, but so I did. I went to medical school and then did a surgery residency, pediatric surgery fellowship, and now very happy as a surgeon at Lurie, take care of a whole broad range of congenital and acquired conditions. And I think my innovation portfolio falls into a couple different buckets. There's the clinical innovator. For me, that is fluorescence guided surgery. So we're in this operating room with all these lights and screens, and pretty much for the first time this decade, there's near infrared capability built into much of that. But for surgeons to learn how to adopt it, we needed a cadre of folks who are comfortable with the limitations and capabilities of near infrared visualization. So I fell very nicely into that. For research, I've had some very early stage development of a tissue diagnostic screening device in the NICU using spectroscopy, using reflectance spectroscopy. And then very proud of my overlap with CTIP, which is as a future founder, I have a surgical medical device that is almost ready to be its own entity and has had great support in the CTIP portfolio.
Thank you, Seth. It's very kind of you to say. It's helpful to hear. So you said, I want to make sure we have the timeline. So med school, surgery residency, fellowship, academic career. But you spent, so was that time in industry was before going to med school?
It sure was.
So what was that? What made you go, working for a J&J subsidiary is nice, but I would like to not sleep for the next 8 years.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. Too much sleep. I think that, well, it's easy for me to, I wonder what I was thinking at age 20, quite frankly. But as I look back, I feel really privileged to be able to bring to that equation of med tech development that clinical perspective, which I think absolutely has some blind spots, but is really rooted in the problem space. So what's going on in this world? What's needed? For me, it's how are you going to help these kids? Now, what are the blind spots? Well, clinicians soon learn that not every good idea is an opportunity, okay? Because you can define everything you want in the problem space, but you need a solution and you need a mode of execution. And when you get to mode of execution, you have to start to think, okay, are there commercialization opportunities? Is this something very rare that that there's a market for? Even if there's not a market, is it worth pursuing because the stakes are very high? So a lot of factors in that. And being very disciplined about exactly what you need. A lot of folks think that pediatric surgeons are in search of the same devices, just smaller. But as we like to say in the children's hospital, children are not just little adults. So it's not like little folks running around getting adult diseases. These are they have their own, physiology and diseases. And so being really focused on, am I just in need of something smaller, or is this something very specific to a pediatric condition?
Absolutely. Jesse, I want to, we heard a little bit about Seth's journey. I'd love to hear about yours. You occupy this interesting space of having experience, doing this translational work now with QSIT, which is the Query Simpson Innovation and
Institute for Translational Engineering for Advanced Medical Systems.
There you go. That's why you asked the expert. But you sort of occupy this interesting space of, I think of, you've had experience in women's health, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that. But this concept of, women's health is underfunded, under-resourced, underexplored. Pediatrics is underfunded, under-resourced, and underexplored. And now you're doing both. And tell us a little bit about that journey for you, of like how what was it about, your early career in education and translation that kind of like brought you here to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. It was slightly more linear than Seth's. So I went to college, studied biology and social anthropology, took 1 year off, lived in Peru doing pap smear screening, which was for me sort of a uh, illustration in sort of dichotomies. We were using like slides with hairspray to, secure on the cells. And then we were transporting those images back to pathologists around the world. So it was this real tension between something super basic and technology. Then I went to med school. I knew I wanted to take care of women and think about how they're such pillars of their communities, and they really define the health of their families and their villages. And so I was pretty focused on either family medicine or OBGYN, but there was really for me, a foundational experience that, like Seth, really happened in the operating room. So I was a third-year medical student, and I was on an OBGYN rotation, and we were doing fibroid surgeries. And fibroids can be any size. And one of the big challenges is, how do you get a big fibroid out of a belly through a small incision? So one of the early devices was called a morcellator, which basically helps to take that tumor, shrink it down into a smaller size inside the belly, and then you can take it out in smaller pieces. So I was on this rotation for 4 weeks. First 2 weeks, all day, every day, we were morcellating. Then a case came out that there was concern that if you morcellate inside the belly, are you spreading potentially undiagnosed cancer inside of that patient? The next 2 weeks, I didn't go to the OR once. And all of it was focused on consent and talking about, how do you counsel patients between getting a big incision or this theoretical risk of using this device that could come to harm. And so for me, it just stuck with me about how, wow, one day the device, we're using it everywhere, and then the next day it disappeared. I go to residency, and contraception is a big part of what OBGYNs do. And so we have a device called eSure, which was, branded as contraception, like a tubal ligation you can get at lunchtime. And basically, through the uterus, you can place coils inside of the tube that cause scarring, helps to lead to permanent tubal ligation. Learned how to do it my first 2 years, disappeared because it turns out something in the coils a lot of people had reactions to, gone from the market. And so I kept having this experience of devices, well-intentioned, but becoming politicized, being pulled from the market. And so that really led me on to sort of a more academic path, to be honest. And I started doing a lot of research about how are devices approved or cleared, because I had no idea about that as a medical student. You don't learn about that. And so this led me to try to look at, how does the FDA clear devices? Is it different in women's health? Like, why is this happening to my patients? And so, again, it started from a very academic perspective. But then I started thinking about, devices are not all bad. Like, they are instrumental to the care that we provide and can be so amazing. So I think it started in this very, interesting space where I saw sort of the torment that sometimes devices can lead in clinical care and the challenges they give us. But it also put me forward on this path of thinking about, how can clinicians be part of this conversation earlier? That was one thing I realized, is clinicians really, we are not educated about how devices come to market. What's the evidence? There's very few OBGYNs, for example, on a lot of these FDA panels. And so having the opportunity to be sort of part of the conversation was a big part for me. And I think there's so much shared between the pediatric and women's health space. We are underfunded, neglected. And so even though we represent an enormous part of our population, so really that difference is a huge amount of tension. So anyways, I caught the bug thinking about devices. And then I did my residency here at Northwestern, and Professor John Rogers over in the material sciences. I'm not an engineer. That's not my expertise, but linking up with him, it was helpful to bring sort of that clinical expertise. He was interested in some neonatal and fetal monitoring. And so I was able to get into his group and start, some early collaboration there. Device and innovation as a team sport. So they really brought that side, and I could bring in some of the subject matter expert. Went to fellowship, then I came back, and then have been, getting my feet underneath me as a early investigator. We'll talk more about funding challenges later, but being at an institution like Northwestern, where there's a lot of philanthropic support and belief in, opportunities for academic centers to help lead this commercialization, make devices that can actually move care at the bedside, has been instrumental in allowing me to remain in this space as a as a, practicing physician now.
That's, that resonates so much with me, my own experience. I'm going to be kind to myself and say that we're all of this roughly the same medical training generation, though I have much more salt and pepper than others on this stage. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like when I was in med school, we had an entire unit in epidemiology where we learned about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. And nowhere did anyone ever talk about medical devices or the FDA or CDRH or 510Ks. But we learned a lot about drug development. And so it's a significant blind spot in how we train our clinical workforce, and then we encounter these issues. I remember the coils that was contemporary with also like the vaginal mesh, right, and the 510K recalls along that. So in 2013 to 2017, roughly. So the FDA has a pathway to clear devices called a 510K, which is essentially what the FDA calls substantial equivalence, meaning a technology, if it is sufficiently similar to some other technology that they've already approved, they may require no clinical data or minimal clinical data. You just have to show that your product is the same as another product that the FDA has already approved. And I think pathway created with the best of intentions. But what ends up happening is that if it turns out that some device has a problem that you only find out 3 or 5 years after it's been on the market and people have been using it, like causing pain, causing inflammation, causing long-term chronic issues, well, now you also have an entire generation of devices that have been approved based on that original device. And until fairly recently, the FDA didn't have a way to check whether the thing you were claiming was your predicate had actually been pulled from the market. So it was complicated for a while. Things have gotten better. But yeah, these interactions with these, what sometimes feel like to us as really opaque systems can be really tough. I want to pick up on something you said. You mentioned John Rogers. John Rogers, for those of you who don't know, is faculty here at Northwestern University in the Department of Engineering. But pretty impressive human being. I think one of only a handful of humans who's appointed to all 3 national academies, so the National Academy of Engineering, the National Academy of Science, the National Academy of Medicine. Wonderful collaborator, brilliant guy. Tell me, I think, would it be fair to say that John played a mentorship role for you? And where along your career have those mentors helped in pursuing this path that is, again, nonlinear and sometimes has different and unique challenges than the usual NIH funding challenges?
Yeah, he's been a great mentor to me. I think a couple of the big things, just sort of nuts and bolts, like he supported me on a loan repayment program through the NIH, which helped me to say, hey, I don't have to take a private practice job. Like I could come back to academics and he would support me on that and it would cover my research time. And he supported me also through the WRHR, which is the Women's Reproductive Health Research Program, which helps to support physician scientists who want to stay in academia. So, he's been tremendous. And I think it's been a really unique mentorship experience because he's not in my specialty. He's not a provider. He's not a physician. And so it feels nice to be able to give something back to your mentor when you feel like you owe them so much. So has been a very fruitful relationship where we both can bring really unique things to the table, but certainly his, brilliance and experience and resources have definitely made this possible.
Seth, what about you? Tell us. I think mentorship, especially early on, can be helpful. Both the absence of and the presence can be formative. Were there, either in your time in industry or in your time in training, were there mentors that helped you kind of figure some of this stuff out?
Well, yeah, I think a lot about this. Surgery is such a hands-on sport that we always feel like we're standing on the shoulders of giants because where you train makes a great deal of difference. That was at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for me. So surgeons along the way helped me get to be good at those things. I think in the space I decided to occupy and that brought me joy in terms of intersection of children's surgery and tech development, I was a little short on mentors. I don't think that may be on me rather than the system, but what I did have was trust from folks because I think that you've said nonlinear a couple of times and that resonates with me because I don't know. I didn't know exactly where I was headed at every moment. But what I will say is that nonlinear doesn't necessarily mean unfocused. And uh, I think I needed folks to trust me that what seemed like a disparate set of activities, interested in fluorescence contrast and a disease that I could characterize with reflectance spectroscopy, had a common link, which was, the what I thought I could bring to bear in terms of device development and improvement on all those conditions. So I had to disregard a lot of well-meaning advice saying, no, in the university infrastructure, you got to pick a disease and stick with it and become expert with that. And I had to say, that nonlinear is not unfocused. Give me some time. And I was lucky to have that trust and support to then eventually have some things to show for it, because that just like your chasm of despair that happens with funding. I mean, there's a long time between that notion and a prototype. And so I really had to stick with it, so to speak.
Yeah, and you highlighted something that I think reminds me of Jesse's answer. You mentioned trust and the environment, and Jesse, you talked about and you being a supportive environment, and I think you're both sort of hearing in that whether you have individual people who are mentoring you, being in a space that will allow for that exploration, those trial and errors of figuring out, sounds like it's also an important part of it. And you had that at Hopkins at the beginning of your career. Jesse, you had that here at NU. Yeah, and I think, in my own experience, I think it's hit or miss. Not every institution is set up for that. Whether it's institutional culture or resources, or whether that's the expertise that they have. So kind of finding those niches. I think that's probably why we also see places who are good at this get very good at this and start doing it. Like the Stanfords of the world, right, who've built the biodesign program, and they also have a PDC and their partnership with Fogarty. So building those ecosystems there. But it sounds, I'd venture to say between NM and the work that we're doing here on Lurie, I think part of what we've been trying to do is how do we position this community, Lurie and Northwestern, to kind of be more of that, of like, this is a place that allows for that exploration and has those resources, and can be a place for someone to come and figure out that part of their career. I wonder, Jesse, if you could tell us a little bit, we're transitioning a little bit more into kind of what you guys are doing now. This new position with QSIT, it sounds super interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about, how you got into that role and what that role means, and kind of some of the things that you're working on now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the design of it is very much to be intentional and just to make sort of Chicago, make Northwestern, make this community with Lurie and Shirley Ryan Ability sort of more of a epicenter of translational science. So what I think the origins of this institute really came from, almost not failures, but sort of false starts is what I would say, where sometimes, devices, prototypes get started and a spin out company happens, or prototypes don't even get that far. And so the whole point is to be sort of a proving ground, to take something that maybe has been tried in 10 to 20 patients, and be able to put the resources behind it, not just monetarily, but, putting in an IRB that could withstand FDA, regulation, having clinical research coordinators who are used to working with devices, and being able to do a larger trial to potentially show like, hey, this device actually improves clinical care, so that we can say, hey, this is a good device. Let's make a company for it. Let's try to get industry partnership, and being just more transparent of saying, this is not about building prototypes. This is about taking something that we think works and finding those relationships, understanding what the market potential is, rather than putting a bunch of resources behind something that could solve a problem, but maybe won't make it to market. Being just a teeny bit more, I think, capitalistic and sort of upfront about it, I would say. So, the Institute really started in the beginning of this year. And so we are in its infancy, but we are really disease and device agnostic. So we have devices that are spanning, from the neonatal ICU with sort of very small scale. Again, a lot of these are coming from Professor Rogers's lab, but very small scale capacity to monitor vital signs and other physiologic markers of neonates, monitoring like leg edema through bioimpedance in the CHF patient populations. We also have funding from Gates Grant to look at some devices in uterine contractility monitoring, pediatrics, voice monitoring with an opera singer over in the Northwestern Undergraduate School. So it's an extremely diverse portfolio, really by intention. And our hope is that we can have some sort of early wins to show that this is a meaningful method of taking a lot of great ideas, a lot of prototypes, and saying, hey, these are the ones that we should stand behind. And I think working really closely with, folks like Lisa Dar over at the incubation lab and Invo, who help to understand what the potential like commercial opportunities could be. Because again, in med school, like we don't learn about the regulatory piece. We don't learn about how to make a business pitch or what the market potential could be, but this campus is so rich in those resources. So it's a really exciting ecosystem to be in, and I hope in a couple years time we can prove that we are like the Fogarty and Mayo Clinic and some of these other ones that have sort of thought of having these incubators within a healthcare space.
And can you tell us a little bit more? You mentioned earlier that you're the director of clinical research for that group.
Yes. So I'm the director of clinical research. So basically I manage the portfolio. We've recruited research assistants, but basically our goal is to help the clinicians who might not have they might not be as fortunate to have cover time. So if we can, hey, we'll put the IRB in, we'll make sure that we do all of the paperwork. So if this goes before the FDA for an audit, we're going to be above board. We have the researcher, assistants to go in and sort of help them collect the data. We have within our system data scientists to help to analyze the data, again, to try to consolidate it all in one place. And so my job is really to interface with potential projects to make sure that they fit within our portfolio. It's a lot of grant writing, like much of, a physician scientist is. So, putting in grants every week is part of the journey, but also trying to manage the projects that we have to make sure that they have the resources to be successful.
That's super exciting. It also, it makes me think of a lot of the work that that CTIP does with the MDCTU and with our I2I team, and thinking of how do we help people with the IRB grant and the design of the regulatory strategy, the design of their study. And you're right, that's such a critical, often either unfunded or underfunded part of it.
Yeah, it's what we like to say.
What's that again?
Unglamorous.
Unglamorous. There, Greg, unglamorous. But critical, right? Without that, like nothing happens. Or if it does, concerningly so. That's really exciting that function exists, and certainly I think opportunities for us to collaborate more on how that happens between Lurie and Northwestern. Seth, tell us more about your portfolio, what you're working on. I know you and Tim Lautz have a partnership in like the innovation work and surgery, and obviously you have a number of different device things that you're doing, and you have grants. Tell us a little bit more about what's occupying your time today.
Well, I'm inspired to hear all the ways you've connected the dots to make an ecosystem. But I think on the Lurie side, I'm in a similarly privileged position. I mean, I think that as we talk about the elements that make an institution, an ecosystem successful, we have all those, and they're building and growing. I mean, it's CTIP and Eye to Eye, our Impact to Innovation program, and others. And so essentially what you're asking me is how many friends do I have? I mean, without boring everyone on the details, but I guess I did foreshadow that, once upon a time I saw this, this linear continuum between clinician and engineer when I was just thinking about the gizmo. And what I came to learn and remember was that then there's just so many different dimensions of it. So I was a little bit self-congratulatory that I could speak clinical and engineering language, and then, needed a real injection of humility that nothing about regulatory, nothing about business planning, fundraising, any of that. So being able to make those friends locally, that's the important thing, because I think no one person can do all of that. And I mean, that's not exactly what you were asking, but you think of me in the same breath as you think of folks with complementary skill sets. And that's what reminded me that, you know, the friends that you have allow you to sort of reach a little further than you can on your own. I mentioned those buckets. They're all very important to me in terms of clinical innovator, research, and device founder. The fluorescence guided surgery is really interesting because it's helping kids right now, but needs development into something that's going to be even bigger and even better. And I just will spend another moment talking about the notion that I found this space where I needed to know about infrared and endoscopes and fiber optic communications in order to do a clinical job better. But thankfully, a lot of that work had already been done commercially, so I just had to pick it up and use it. That's been a very different journey than what I've embarked with CTIP and Bianca over there, where we have to say, well, then before you even get all the way to that finish line so that enterprising clinicians can use it, the number of people you have to convince that a good idea is both safe and an opportunity is tremendous, because uh, it's got to get through FDA regulatory stuff. Then you've got to convince the hospital that it's a worthy purchase, that it's not just good for you as a clinician and good for the children, but somehow it's also got to be for the institution to even support you. I didn't think they had any say in the matter, but you come to learn sort of where the at least Katie's laughing because as someone that pushes us in that right direction. So but again, what seemed like disparate things have common threads, and because I've fashioned myself now as a clinician that understands light and sound, and then has interest, energy, passion in bringing those to bear. That's sort of ultimately that's what I can now turn to the folks who trusted me for so long and say that's my connector. That's how it works.
That's fair. And I think, I think of it as humans, we're definitely capable of being good at like one thing, right? Like you can be, in the bell curve, you can be 1 sigma, right? And like, great, 67% of us can be really good at least one thing. And then you add a 2 sigma and you're like, great, like 88% of us can be good at like 2 things. And then you get to 3 sigma and you're like, ooh, can people be really good at 3 things? And then after that, it's a real tail, and maybe that's where like the John Rogers of the world live, is in that tail. But the rest of us, like, we need friends, right? Because if you think about the journey, in med device development, it's clinical, it's engineering, it's thinking about what the clinical workflow is going to end up at the other end. It's the regulatory strategy, it's the reimbursement plan, it's the business, it's the marketing, it's the pitch. And I don't know anyone that knows all of those pieces. And so, like, building teams like at QSIT is a huge important part of that. Building ecosystems like what we're doing here is really critical, like you were saying, Seth, because there's no one person has all those pieces. It's too specialized, it's too different, and it really requires bringing those pieces together. But that's also part of the fun, is that puzzle, is figuring out how do we put those pieces together, to ultimately, right, like the shared goal, which is we want better health outcomes for children. One of the ways that we get better health outcomes is by having better devices that are specifically designed and tested, validated for children. And so that's the journey that we're all trying to get to.
Well, I describe it as ingredients in the pantry. I mean, the pantry's stocked around here, but you need recipe books, and you need cooks to put it all together. We don't need extra shopping for the different pieces of the puzzle. It's a lot of it's connecting.
Maybe QSIT is like an Instapot.
And I think it's also like memory. So like you had to figure all this out on your own, and that's a non-linear path. It also takes a long time. What is the average? Like 10 years from if on a good day from conception to having something come to market. So it's a massive investment. And so I think like things like QSI teams are, I'm not an engineer, but hey, can I make that clinical piece 1 year shorter? Can I shorten that time to getting a portfolio ready to hand over to the FDA? I think again, knowing your place in this process is really powerful, and that you don't have to be everything. That world is done.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like no one can be, and no one should try. It should be what is your contribution? What are you going to bring to the table? How are you going to work well with others? Yeah, I think that's really important. I think about some of the technologies in the CTIP portfolio, especially some of our more invasive, class 3 PMA type technologies that have been in development for 17 years. Between the early bench work, then like the wet bench work, then the animal models, then the first in human. Where we have one of those studies. Actually, your partner Tim Lautz is currently considering evaluating or being on a project with one of these companies that's been, again, to do their first in human trials, and it's complicated. It's hard. The financing is complicated. The contracting is complicated. It's high risk, and it's taken 16 years just to get to a first in human feasibility study. So it's a long journey, and I think that reality check is also helpful for anybody who's interested in this as a career. Is that if you want fast, like go work on consumer facing, build a dog sitting app. Like that's fine. You can do that in 3 months and get it in the app store. But if you want, surgical interventions in pediatric ICU patients, like strap in. It's a journey. One of the things we've sort of both of you have alluded to, and maybe you've bookmarked for later, is some of the challenges around time, around funding. I think for each of you, you've kind of handled those a little bit differently. But maybe you can speak a little bit to that, both in places where potentially today you're in a better place, but I'm sure at different points in your career, maybe it was like, ooh, I don't have protected time to do that. Or we don't have funding to do this project. Can you maybe it might be helpful for folks to hear a little bit about some of those challenges, whether they're current or past, and how you've addressed them. And maybe Jesse, if you want to go first.
Sure. I think funding is like lives in a big part of our mind all the time. And so, I mentioned before, I've been very fortunate through, some things funded through the NIH and sort of my training and loan repayment programs to cover med school costs that really helped me to be able to be flexible about career choices that I chose. I think, since becoming a early investigator, it occupies just a lot of your time thinking about how you're going to keep your team sustainable. And so it's constantly looking to see what resources are out there. And I would say that the landscape has really changed in good and bad ways. I mean, I think last year, at least at Northwestern, it sort of rocked our world with the faith in the NIH and sort of our relationship with it. So that was a hard year. But I think what I am seeing, the trends globally, trends in funding, is recognizing that commercialization is a huge opportunity. So some of these moonshot programs like ARPA-H, DARPA, they're increasingly wanting to see these teams of where you have industry, where you have regulatory experts, and they're designing, like their goal is to make a product that goes to market, which I think is unique and hasn't really existed before the last 2 to 3 years. But I would say ARPA-H is constantly coming out with new calls for things about sleep, about imaging, about antibiotics, this whole range of things. So I think those are great sources of funding. I mean, high risk, high reward. But again, our pantry is stocked and you can build some really compelling applications. Increasingly, also the NIH, I think, is looking at commercialization as an end goal. There are programs like SBIRs and STTRs, which, if you partner with a small business or even as an academic, you can serve as a PI, partnering with a business. And those are great resources through the NIH. And then I think the other part is industry, is a place like Lurie and Northwestern, like they have connections with Procter and Gamble, with AbbVie, with different industry folks who want to take advantage of the clinical resources we have here and also want to bring the science forward. So I think being open opportunity, very flexible, thinking about how your portfolio sometimes works into these calls is sometimes feels a little bit like being a gymnast, but it's all for this greater good of keeping the science going.
No, and you touched on so many things. Maybe I'll follow up on one of them for now, which is you mentioned obviously changes in NIH funding, which we don't have to go into too much detail here, but certainly it was never easy to get NIH funding. It's certainly not getting easier.
I agree.
How maybe potentially compared to that, how do you people who worry about like, ooh, it's hard to find funding from industry, from philanthropy, from ARPA or DARPA or NSF, like these other spaces, do you have a sense of how you might compare the what it looks like to seek funding from those different kinds of spaces? Maybe they're probably not a one-to-one comparison, but it just having been in that position, be interesting to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like even though the path is never totally transparent, at least with like the NIH, there was decades of people before us who could say, hey, this is the pathway, and R21 and R01, like this is the progress you go. This is your specific aim page was sort of unchanged. And I think, not to dwell on it, but I think last year shook our confidence in an NIH that we sort of thought was like, this will always be there. This is a tried and true sort of place where we can get funding from. And it takes a lot to put together an R01 application and to have all of that effort be like, oh gosh, maybe it's not even going to get considered. That was kind of earth shattering. And so then it does make you say, hey, I got to open my eyes and think about what other resources are out there. Again, I think inside the clinical world, I think we're more comfortable with the NIH, but I think, again, collaborators like, Professor Rogers, some of the engineering and chemistry folks are more, have sought funding from other sources. And so it's helpful to have those mentors in your life who can say, hey, we've had success here, or let's build a team to answer this call, and sort of thinking a little bit bigger than what initially sort of felt traditional with the NIH.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think, and you mentioned something that I think is the difference between as clinicians, we have one might say privilege, maybe we could describe it as golden handcuffs of, well, if my research funding goes away, I'll just do more clinic, but I still have a job. And for some of our colleagues, like who are entirely like soft money funded, they're like, oh no, if my research funding goes away, my job goes away. And so it's kind of a different pressure. Yeah. Seth, tell us a little bit about, your experience, and then I might, I'll pre-prompt you with, as you think about that, something Jesse said was, the role of industry. And I think among some folks in academia, there's always a little bit of a arm's length with industry and what industry will fund and what kind of partnerships. And I think that there's a good reason for some of that, but I think also industry can be a great catalyst to support research. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on kind of funding, the current funding environment, challenges, and maybe especially having been in industry before coming to academia, your thoughts on that.
So many thoughts.
I know, sorry.
Well,
Ratchet up the hard.
no, look, getting funding is never easy for anyone, just to say that. I thought early on, 10 years ago, that I was particularly ill positioned because, though you said the word increasingly a couple of times, think, okay, maybe now there are some NIH mechanisms with commercialization and there's ARPA-H, but not tried and true, just to reiterate that. And I felt like I got bounced around by program officers. It wasn't quite in Kennedy Shriver land, and it wasn't quite in NHL BI or NIBIB. Plus, those generations of NIH reviewers really think they want to advance clinical care and understanding of disease, and MedTech doesn't always do that. It's not all. There are some things you just empirically do because it's better, faster, safer, but it's not necessarily an understanding of disease. So I had really cobbled together a string of foundation university adjacent funding, which is like the Chicago Biomedical Consortium, which is kind of like university adjacent, and industry. And it's to the extent that when things went topsy-turvy last year, I mean, I didn't gloat, but it didn't affect my portfolio. I was like, oh my gosh, I, I'm spared the angst of some of those waves. I think, yeah, you gave me a little bit of a platform to say, I didn't get, I'm more clinician than industry based. But that short stint did allow me to be really disciplined at obtaining some industry partnerships. I did that with discipline to know what they're thinking and to be really transparent up front that I had different aims and goals. And so maybe we could find some overlap, but the problem is always the different incentives and plus the conflicts of interest. I think eh, if handled, there's plenty of Venn diagram overlap. Let's move forward together. And it sure helps to clear the air ahead of time to say, hey, for example, hey, maybe we do this, but I want it in writing that if you're not submitting to the FDA for this, I'm in control of the data and the publishing. You don't want an embargo on the work that you've just done. Um, and it's all going to be, I'm going to write the IRB. We're not using a central IRB that maybe you have relationships with. So I think there are ways to do it. I think the university leadership increasingly says, well, all the money is green. And so if some sources appear to wax and wane, you need to, just like all things, you need to diversify your portfolio because you can't see what's coming. And so, yeah, I think especially for the innovator and for MedTech device development in particular, kind of the alternate streams are mandatory.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've sometimes compared it to, industry funding has its own kind of volatility, right? Their financial cycles, responding to their investors, to their market, to regulatory demand, et cetera. But to some extent, it works within a set of confines. And I think, at least right now, federal funding is experiencing a different kind of volatility where we don't know what the confines are. And so being able to be conversant in both is really important. Please.
I am embarrassed to say I forgot to mention this, but I think other like philanthropic funding sources, either locally or also things like the Gates Foundation, they have a huge interest in device, and increasingly they are seeking to have a more focus on products that go to commercialization that help both the global north and south. So both in maternal health, women's health, but also in pediatrics. So I think they're also a great source that is sort of under pressure to give away a lot of money. So I think that is also a great resource, but also there's some volatility that comes with having philanthropy based from an individual who has a personality, who also has whims that wax and wane. So all of it is fragile.
Diversify your portfolio. It's true for grant funding. It's true for your personal finances. I'll ask, both of you have been involved with specific projects, with early stage things that either have spun out or might spin out. So I'll pose this question to each of you: is, given your current, where you are in your experience, what would it take for you to like leave academia and go be that CEO or CMO of that startup? Like, would you ever consider that? Is there an opportunity? What might you say, like, ooh, Northwestern, Lurie, this has been great, but I'm going to go run this 10-person team and run a Series A and give it a shot. Is that in you? Is that something you'd be interested in?
No. I'll be honest, I have had a front row seat to it. So my husband was a clinician, and then he is now a CEO of a MedTech startup. And I describe it as being on a roller coaster ride that I did not ask to be on. The highs are super high, the lows are super low, and it is a 24/7 job. And also I couldn't balance a spreadsheet. So I think like I know where my true north is. I like that patience. I like science. I like writing a manuscript, and that is my sweet spot, and I am totally comfortable with that. It is great if you fit it, but it is strap in. Sorry. I clearly have a lot of.
No,
I-
no, that's great. That's,
well,
that's what
I
we're here
envy
for.
your certainty. I mean, no, that is great to know your true north. I guess that's a provocative set of questions. I have to ask if my leadership is listening in. You know, no, yeah,
Tom,
exactly.
earmuffs.
I think, look, I just love what I do and would have never admitted out loud that I would quit the day job. But you know, we have stages to our life and career, and I think as of course, I don't know your husband's exact path through it, Jesse, but I know that when it's your own pet project, no, I'm probably not available for recruiting for, you know, CMO headhunting. But, you know, when it's your own incubated idea, um, I think that's a tough set of circumstances because it benefits the most from your own founding time and energy, and yet are you giving up your ability to put it to good use, which was presumably the genesis of all of it? So I think maybe because I haven't lived it as much of a front row seat, I hedge a little bit more on that question. But that is the question you have to ask yourself, because there's a cadence at which things can move if you have a day job, so to speak, and then there's what you could achieve if you really, you know, leaned into it.
Yeah, well, and I think there's also just a really important like uh reality check, self-awareness of like, and am I the right person to do that? Which is something that certainly like when we work with our portfolio of companies, sometimes it's a hard conversation of we think this product is great and this may not be the right team or the right set of individuals. And either how do we augment the team? How do we support the team? How do we coach the team up? But it happens all the time with innovation. Please.
It's hard to do both. It's hard to be a product CEO on nights and weekends, you know, and it's hard to be a clinician on nights and weekends. It's really hard to find space in a, you know, we all have the same hours in the day.
Yeah.
It's hard to balance.
Well, the over-unders are on the prediction markets, so we'll check in 5 years. Yeah, it's a tough. I think I think of it. You know, in my career, I had an early startup, not in the medtech space, and I'm very glad not to be there anymore. You know, I like the role is operator, and that's the space in the ecosystem that I think like I'm that like that's my sweet spot. That's what I can contribute is being that the operator, which is also just like a funny word that, but that's a thing in the sector. It just makes me think of Sade. You know, I want to turn it over to the audience, both virtually and in the room, for questions in a second. But first, I want to thank both of you for being so candid and sharing so much about your experience. Thank you so much. We'll open it up to folks here in the room or online. If you have a question online, feel free to place it, and Bianca will help us get that question. But anyone here in the room have a question for our guests? Yes, please.
I would rather invest in an A team for a B product than an A product and a B team. People don't experience market. How do you assemble that A team? How do you know if you have
A good question. I have a version. Here, maybe I'll start and I'll let folks think a little bit about it. It's super hard is the answer, and I think it almost never happens from the start. I think you get to an A team, you almost never start with an A team. Over the last 10 or so years, you've had the rise of like the fractional CXO. So like essentially like professional startup leaders. So individuals who are like, great, you essentially pay me to spend 10 hours a week being your chief compliance officer. And so for a lot of companies, if they've had the appropriate amount of fundraising and capital, and they have the right commitments, they can then start doing that. If you're earlier than that, where you can't afford a fractional CXO, then it's okay, cool. Who are your friends, and who's willing to kind of take that leap with you? And I say friends casually, but I also mean like at your organizations, what are your support mechanisms? Yeah. So if you have no friends, first of all, we can be friends. I think it's leaning into your community. So, for example, in Chicago, there's organizations like Matter, like MHub, like the CBC, who provide some of this ecosystem type support, right? Whether it's everything from meetups to like free office hours. So I think it is just as much about building your product and your pitch, to then build your network. And then as you're building that network, you're meeting people. And I think you also have to be prepared to know, what are you willing to give up to bring people in? Is it percent? Is it equity? Is it percent? Is it income? Is it, what are the things that you're going to be able to do that? Early on, it's things like, well, if this succeeds, there will be something in it for you. And a little bit later on, then you're essentially paying for it, right? You're hiring these individuals. Again, you might be hiring them against some kind of equity vehicle. You might be hiring them, like actually just paying them a salary. But yeah, it's absolutely true. I think from our network of investors, we've often heard oh, that's fine. This didn't work because I'm going to invest in that founder's next venture. And they're really, what they're following is founders, not technologies. So yeah, I think that the people are really critical. Yeah, be friends with John Rogers.
Well, I think those ecosystem builders are so valuable. I guess I was also going to add that every time I've pitched my idea to someone, because I mean, I'll monologue on the stuff that I'm really passionate about, quite a long time, but I do always remind myself to stick in some awkward, open-ended blank spaces, because I don't know, folks don't, whether it's the product or the team, folks don't want to give you constructive criticism, and that's hard. That takes a real high degree of self-scrutiny and humility. So I just am always making sure to listen for clues that, well, because you have to know where you stand with both the product and the team. So just having thick skin and being willing to, which I'm sure you have, but I just, that's got to be a part of it.
I think there's a lot of self-education that happens, like reading a lot of books about how to lead a team, how to build a team. And then also, I think, like you said, knowing when to step back. If you can recognize, like, I believe in this product, but maybe at my heart of hearts, I'm not a CEO. I don't know how to lead or manage people or talk about cap tables and all of this stuff. And that's okay to say. Like, again, everybody has their strengths. But I think it's hard to step away when you have created and built something. But a product CEO is rare.
Katie.
Your training and experiences you had in the clinic sort of early on and how that shaped where you are today and what you're choosing to do was just really great. I think I'm curious, like you talked, I think it was touched on the way that device development has changed and different resources that are available. Like for each of you, either in your field or otherwise, what excites you most about how device development is evolving? Are there things that you're like, oh, it gets me out of bed in the morning to think about X happening in the future?
Well, we've touched on it briefly, but the fact that there's a whole gamut of mainstream funding opportunities that require a commercialization aim, that just is, it's not remarkable in and of itself, but it's a proxy for this notion that we're sitting in a university environment that doesn't have to be arm's length from the stuff that actually gets dusted off and used and made and helps people in real time. So I just think that increasingly, we it wasn't too many times. It was just the right number of times, Jesse. That I see more than I can apply for with respect to something that now I think it could be. You have to tell the difference if you're looking at the system from way above. You don't want that to be gimmicky or just buzzword creating, but to the extent that it creates a culture, I think that's worthwhile.
I think we're living in a really exciting time also with the advent of large language models and AI that is changing the game. And I think another part that we haven't touched too much on, we talked a lot about devices in the OR and imaging, but another huge part is like we're getting huge volumes of data from patients, whether it's from a ring, from a watch, from a patch. And it is exciting to think about what is in that data. And we're just skimming the surface now. So I think for, thinking about remote care, thinking about how we deliver care in less invasive ways and, care that has traditionally required a really high touch. I just think the opportunities are endless, and we finally have the tools to start to analyze all of that large volumes of data that we're collecting.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for everybody who's here in the room, everybody who's joining us online. Jesse and Seth, thank you for being a part of this today, for agreeing to to this weird little journey that we went on together. Hopefully, it was nice for you to do a little self-reflection and share about your experiences. I know it was great for our audience to learn a little bit more about how one becomes this kind of human. So thank you for sharing that with us today.